Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, I released part 1, and wow, it really exploded, at least by my standards, and in a good way. Honestly, I'm a bit overwhelmed at how much attention it received. So to address one major thing I messed up in my last video, I don't know how to pronounce Baltic language sites. So this is where the graves are, and this is the name of it and how you say it. It is in Mūkši, along with the Mūkši Bronze Age hill fort. Kernavė in Lithuania is here, and is, by all accounts, easier to reach than Mūkši. I am sorry I didn't include these maps or spelling in my last video. Usually I do, and I'll continue to do so in future videos, including this one. Anyway, I finished off the last time with Baltic prehistory, examining the early inhabitants down to the Iron Age. The prehistoric era of the Baltics continued for longer than almost anywhere else in Europe, along with other nations viewing them as a peripheral area, distant and not worth much thought. Until, that is, they began raiding the rest of Europe. That leads us here to Latvia, where the Vikings had a huge port. Now, the Baltics probably aren't the first countries you think of when you hear the term Viking, but this is honestly a mistake. Which brings me here to Grabinia, or as the Vikings knew it, Seaburg, which was inhabited by Vikings from about 650 CE onwards, and it remained inhabited by them until the Teutonic Knights removed them in the 13th century. So, quick disclaimer. I'm aware that historically speaking, Vikings are called Norse, but I'm not going to do that in this video because Norse specifically refers to people from Scandinavia, and as it turns out, referring to the Vikings from here as Norse, suggesting they came from Scandinavia, may not actually be the correct term. So I'm going to continue using the term Viking for this video, but it's worth taking a minute to examine why this is a bit controversial in this area, and it's worth giving attention to both narratives. But first, please remember that I do this on my own, in my free time. I'm a real archaeologist as my primary job, which means that I don't use AI beyond part of the occasional thumbnail, because as an archaeologist, I really suck at using modern technology. So show your appreciation by liking and subscribing, because otherwise I have no way to know how these videos are being received. So let's discuss the traditional narrative first. Today, Grabinia sits inland, but back when this town was Seaburg, it was a Viking town inhabited by a people who, by any archaeological measure, were Vikings. Typically, this town is said to be founded in the 7th century when the Norse arrived on these shores in their first stage of outward colonization. This was about a century and a half before the Viking raids on Lindisfarne in 793, typically considered the start of Europe's Viking Age. We began pushing this date back in the Baltics quite recently due to an increasing amount of archaeological finds, but pushing this date back so early moved from the controversial to the confirmed with the discovery of the Salme I ship burials on the island of Saaremaa, Estonia. Given the interest that the last video has had, and based on the comments that I've received, I will probably do a separate video on the Salme ship burials in the future, because there's a lot to say about them. So for today, I'm going to keep it very basic. So, there are two ships here, discovered in 2008 and 2010, and they differ from usual Norse boat graves. For one thing, most Viking boat burials are for one person, typically an elite or respected individual. But in Salme, dozens of individuals are known from each ship, buried in a mass grave. Secondly, they were further east than any previously known boat burial. In addition to this, they're old. They predate the so-called Viking era by more than a century, yet they're indisputably Viking. For our purposes, the second ship is the one we'll focus on. This one is larger and contains the bodies of 33 men who almost certainly died in battle. Who they were fighting remains a mystery, although Viking records do state they had battles with the prehistoric peoples of Estonia in the 7th century. The tale of Sweden's Ingvar is a particularly popular interpretation. The archaeology at first glance does not really seem to bear this out. For one thing, Ingvar was seeking wealth, and Saaremaa would have offered very little. Of course, these graves were never looted, and workers did have the time to build them, so clearly the battle did not take place on this beach. But the second piece of evidence is more compelling and interesting. The Salme II ship burial had arrowheads embedded into its hull in a style which suggested they were fighting other Scandinavians. Now, some could say that the battle took place on a foreign land between two rival factions who happened to bump into each other, But if you ask Marika Mägi, an archaeologist at Tallinn University, you might get a different interpretation. And again, apologies if I am mispronouncing that name. But Mägi represents the head of a growing faction of archaeology, saying that the prehistoric people of the Baltic coast were Vikings too, or specifically the people of the Finno-Estonian sphere. A Viking, Mägi rightly points out, is better thought of as a profession, like a crusader or a pirate, and as such was open to Baltic people as well. She also presents the Baltics as having two overarching cultural areas, Vendish in the inland, and a Finno-Estonian Viking sphere in Estonia and along the coast. And she has evidence to back this up, both historical and archaeological, which brings us back to Grobinja and sites like it. Grobinja's original sites don't exist much anymore, with their artifact being sent to a museum in the modern port, the nearby city of Allmäea. And the artifacts here are in line with Mägi's assertion. All the archaeological evidence from this area seems to match those found in eastern Sweden and Gotland, with the only difference being graves. Ship burials are uncommon in the Baltics, and unlike Scandinavians, their graves do not contain goods. Otherwise, coastal archaeological remains in the Baltics and Estonia are indistinguishable from those in contemporary eastern Sweden. Thus, the Salme I burial being both in a battle with other Vikings and Estonians would make perfect sense under Mägi's assertion. This would also explain a supply route into Kiev and Rus. Mägi argues that weapons found there that are said to come from eastern Sweden may actually come from the Baltics, but were mistaken by previous archaeologists for fully Swedish weapons. And you can't deny this logic. After all, to sail down the Dnieper from the Baltic Sea, you have to go through the Baltics. So if Baltic weapons are indistinguishable from Swedish ones, and as I've always said, no culture is homogeneous and cultural mixing has always occurred, then why should we assume that there was no Baltic involvement, especially in the East? Mägi's theory is not universally accepted, of course, and this is to be expected. If the Swedish Vikings were in the Baltics earlier, it would make sense for their culture to eventually blend or assimilate their own region on the coast, especially if it became colonial. But either way, the Baltic coast was part of the Viking sphere, as was Estonia. Grobinja Seaberg, then, represents the southernmost coastal extent of this cultural sphere, which should be expanded to include most of Estonia and southwestern Finland. The Wends, meanwhile, lived in Lithuania and Latvia. While this particular narrative is by no means agreed upon, one thing every Norse archaeologist agrees on is that between Salme and the Baltic Vikings, our picture of this society is missing some pretty big pieces. Our interpretation of Norse and Viking history, particularly in the Baltics, needs serious reworking. Because whether you believe Mägi's reinterpretation or not, the traditional narrative leaves a big blank space in the Baltic regions, one which Mägi's narrative does at least fill. But geographically, the Baltics are ignored in traditional Viking histories despite the fact there are numerous Viking-like sites in the region. Salme might be the most impressive Viking site of the area, but it is not the only one. The way traditional histories treat the Baltics in this era does not really mesh with what the archaeology is saying. Why the modern world doesn't usually discuss Baltic Vikings probably has to do with modern politics and history. As Scandinavia was examining its national identity and romanticizing its past, the Baltics were stuck trying to save their identity's very existence from the Russians, and then maintaining a fragile independence only to see it wiped out again by the Soviet Union. It's only in the last 30 years or so that the Baltic nations have been free to explore this Viking past, and the research coming out is indeed rewriting Norse history. But what happened to these hints of Norse culture if this is the case? What brought this pagan past to an end? And what was happening in these non-Norse areas? Well, that brings us to another site in Latvia, the castle of Citations. Now, I have a pretty educated audience, so I'm going to assume that you know about the Crusades. But did you know about the Northern Crusades? Well, back in the 13th century, the Pope granted the Teutonic Knights the right to crusade across the Baltic states.
Here at Citations, the foundations were laid for the very first Teutonic Order castle in the area. It was built to Christianize the Wends, who were the last pagan peoples of Europe, and the foundations for this castle were laid in 1209.
This led to what has been termed the Northern or Baltic Crusades, which brought the Baltics into recorded history. But why here in the middle of Latvia, especially as they would move their capital to Riga just a few years later? Well, because history isn't black and white. While there was strong resistance to Christianization, it was not uniform, nor was it the only thing the Teutonic Knights offered. The knights were mostly German, and as such had strong connections to the Holy Roman Empire and all the economy and prestige that came with it. Likewise, they also had special favors from the Pope, meaning the entire Catholic Church was at their disposal. Both of these connections allowed the Teutonic Knights to buy favors, open market access, and ensure supply chains. The locals in the area of Chassis liked what the Teutonic Knights could offer them in terms of economic opportunity and technology, so the tribe here granted them the right to use this land and build a castle. And from this castle, the Teutonic Order began to convert the population. And in a way, the tribe here did benefit. The people around Chassis were known as the Lets and flew a red banner with a white stripe. The parallels with modern Latvia are fairly clear. Anyway, let's move on. The Knights established territorial integrity fairly quickly, although conversion was a slower and more arduous process. The Teutonic Order shifted to Riga, which remains the capital of Latvia today. It was on the wide Daugava River and offered a better port and central location. But you can see Chassis still had a special place of significance. These walls show it. And frankly, if you're going to visit any of these sites on a Baltic trip, this is the one to visit.
Oh, this was fun in all the best ways, especially in the dark corridors where all they give you is an actual medieval lantern to see. If you ever come to Latvia, this is 100% recommended.
The Teutonic Order built more castles and soon formed their own state, which stood for over 3 centuries. During that time, they erased pagan heritage but faced down competition from other great powers. Novgorod and later Muscovy posed a continual threat to the Knights' existence and eventually did conquer Livonia in the 16th century. Chassis itself fell to Muscovy in 1577 during its first real siege. Grim reminders of this battle were discovered in this room, where archaeologists dug up the skeletons of women and children, likely sheltering from the siege shortly before the Knights blew the gunpowder storage and the army of Muscovy breached the defenses. But Muscovy wasn't the only one looking to conquer this region. Sweden became another competing power, particularly in Estonia. The Swedes quickly seized the land as the Teutonic state began to fail, and these previously Norse areas we discussed earlier, Finland, Estonia, and parts of Latvia, very quickly fell into Nordic hands, likely because they did feel a cultural connection to parts of it. Certainly this is the case with Sweden. The impressive walls of Tallinn were begun by the Danes in 1265, but it was only after the Swedish conquest of 1561 that it really took on the modern design. Sweden's efforts, particularly those of King Eric XIV, can be seen everywhere. The town was given huge bastions around the walls, which today act as public parks and green spaces. These half-moon-shaped turrets are totally unique to Tallinn. The city was expanded and fortified so heavily because the Russians posed a serious threat to the area, and would even seize Estonia in the Great Northern War. But part of the Teutonic Knights' fall was simply that crusading depended on conquest, and when there were no more pagan lands to conquer, administration was rather weak. To the north, Norse identity, which had become Swedish, was suppressed in favor of various Russification policies, which you can see evidence for around the city, mostly in rejection of them. Meanwhile, to the south, the Knights could not conquer Lithuania because Lithuania had already converted to Catholicism. The Lithuanians, as the closest Wends to Christian Europe, began to organize and construct a well-ordered state. And it's now we return to Kernavė from the first video.
Now this is important not only because this is where humans first settled in Lithuania, but also because this is where the first Grand Duke of Lithuania was coronated. It was also where the first king of Lithuania was coronated, the first and only king, by the way. So it's no wonder that Kernavė is not only very important to Lithuania's cultural history, but is even considered the birthplace of Lithuania.
Is coronated a word, by the way? It is, but it sounds weird. Did I say it right? Apparently, the Baltic languages aren't the only languages I have trouble with. Anyway, this first king was Mindaugas, who, in 1248, converted to Christianity as part of a deal to gain Teutonic and Polish support in a civil war. He was then baptized and, in 1253, crowned the official king of Lithuania here in Kernavė. The Teutonic Knights retained some presence in the country, however, and still waged war with the state of Lithuania. This castle in Kaunas is a prime example of the Teutonic presence in Lithuania. But overall, Lithuania remained a strong state, one that the Teutonic Knights failed to subdue. But paganism wasn't the only thing that Lithuania left behind. They also ditched Kernavė as their capital. Trakai took its place sometime around 1316. Trakai was chosen because the Duke fell in love with the scenery, and honestly, who can blame him? This is a beautiful lake, and it's a beautiful castle, and the only one on an island in the whole of Eastern Europe. But it wasn't long before Vilnius took its place and remained Lithuania's capital throughout its existence, except for a brief period in the early 20th century when Kaunas served as the capital. Vilnius was surrounded by 3 very tall hills which were ideal vantage points for castles and defense. The Tower of Gediminas is particularly notable, and even today you can see a stark difference. The old city on the south side of the Neris and the new city on the north. Lithuania had begun massive expansion stretching deep into Ukraine and in 1383 entered its first union with Poland. This union continued to exist in some form right down until 1795 when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ceased to exist. As a result, much of Lithuania's culture became Polonized, so mingled with the culture and history of Poland that it's often forgotten about as a partner. And while there are records of resentment or pushback from Lithuanian nobles and elites about this union at various times, that's outside the scope of this video. And this did overall strengthen Lithuania. As Russia expanded into the Baltics, the country's union with Poland allowed it to hold out much longer than the other Baltic states. And it wasn't for lack of threats either, as is shown by the Vilnius Bastion, which was besieged by Russia from 1655 to 1661. Thus, these original Baltic tribes all went in their own direction, evolving in their own way, and rather than fade into obscurity of the distant past, they persisted. Their traditions remained unique, shaped by different historical paths. Although often lumped together by international geopolitics, it's clear that the 3 Baltic states are also very different from each other, with unique and ancient identities connected to their land and their neighbors. Now, I don't know what I expected when I visited the Baltics, but I know that what I got was so much better than whatever it was. They are a center of modernity, festival, nature, and defiance in the face of imperialism, a resilient people who you'd never guess were Soviet 35 years ago. Yet, looking into their past, it becomes obvious. These people have always existed. Their past has always been here. It's only now, at this time in history, that we've been lucky enough to see it studied and brought back into the foreground. Anyway, until next time, I'm the archaeologist, and this has been The Travels. Okay, that was a long one. But there was so much interest in part 1 that I really wanted part 2 to deliver on the anticipation. I probably could have cut this again into 2 videos, but honestly, that would have kept you on the hook and gotten more views, been better for my algorithm, potentially gotten me more subscribers, allowed me to not do so much research for a new video over the Christmas holidays. Hey, why didn't I make a part 3 again?